the veteran shouted, mocking him in front of everyone who knew his reputation. "You can't fight," he said, confident no one would disagree. Bruce Lee didn't respond. He didn't argue. He didn't move. At first, then in less than 5 seconds, everything changed. The room went silent, not because it was violent, but because it was final. Years later, witnesses would still struggle to describe what they had seen. The room was not large, and it was not designed to impress. It was a working space. Wooden floors worn smooth by years of repetition, mirrors dulled by age rather than neglect. The air carried the faint scent of sweat and disinfectant, familiar to anyone who had spent time training seriously. This was not a place where legends were announced. They accumulated quietly. The men inside understood hierarchy without needing it explained. At the center of that hierarchy stood the veteran martial artist. He had taught for decades, long enough that some of his earliest students now brought their own students to observe. His reputation did not rely on spectacle. It rested on time, on survival in an era when reputations were built face to face, not at a distance. When he spoke, others listened out of habit as much as respect. He had corrected countless postures, dismissed countless techniques. His authority was not loud, but it was assumed. In this room, his words often ended discussions before they fully formed. Bruce Lee did not occupy a central position. He stood slightly off to one side, not leaning, not pacing. There was nothing performative about his presence. He was dressed simply, without insignia or markers of rank. To someone unfamiliar with him, he could have been mistaken for an observer rather than a participant. Those who already knew him noticed something else. Not tension, not anticipation, just stillness. The kind that comes from attention rather than restraint. The veteran had been speaking for several minutes, about practicality, about tradition, about what worked when resistance was real. His tone was measured but firm. He was not lecturing, he was reinforcing boundaries. The room accepted this as normal. Bruce Lee did not interrupt. He did not nod in agreement or disagreement. He did not shift his stance to signal readiness. His posture remained neutral, balanced without being rigid. It was the posture of someone listening fully without preparing a rebuttal. The room, for the moment, belonged to the veteran. History, experience, and familiarity placed him there. No one questioned it. No one needed to. What no one in the room could yet measure was how fragile that balance was, not because it was wrong, but because it was about to be tested in a way that did not look like a challenge at all. Nothing had happened yet. And yet, in hindsight, this was the moment witnesses would return to, the last moment when everything appeared settled. The shift began without ceremony. It was not announced, and it was not framed as a confrontation. The veteran continued speaking, but his attention narrowed. His eyes moved from the group to Bruce Lee, and the room followed that movement almost instinctively. The words that followed were not shouted. They were delivered evenly, with the confidence of someone accustomed to agreement. He spoke about real fighting, about methods that held up under pressure. Then, without naming Bruce Lee directly at first, he dismissed what he called imitation, systems built for appearance rather than effect. Everyone understood who he meant. When the veteran finally addressed Bruce Lee, he did so plainly. There was no profanity, no theatrical aggression. That was part of what made it uncomfortable. He suggested that Bruce Lee's approach looked impressive but lacked substance. He questioned whether it could survive contact with resistance. He used a word that lingered in the air longer than he intended: fake. The room did not react immediately. No one laughed. No one protested. Silence filled the space between the words and their consequences. A few people shifted their weight, aware that something had crossed from discussion into judgment. This was no private correction. It was a public dismissal, spoken in front of peers and students. The veteran did not seem to consider this unfair. From his perspective, authority included the right to draw lines, to separate what he believed was authentic from what he believed was not. Bruce Lee did not respond at once. He did not look away, but he did not stare. His expression did not change in any noticeable way. If there was offense taken, it did not register outwardly. Those watching expected something, an explanation perhaps, or a verbal defense. Bruce Lee had a reputation elsewhere, but not everyone in the room knew it. To some, he was simply a younger practitioner with unconventional ideas. To others, he was already a curiosity. No one knew which version would speak now. The veteran waited, not impatiently, but confidently. In his experience, silence often meant concession. If Bruce Lee said nothing, the point would stand. If he argued, the hierarchy would reassert itself through words. What unsettled a few observers was not Bruce Lee's quiet, it was how complete it was. He did not prepare to answer. He did not ask permission to speak. He did not seek approval from the room. The insult remained in the open, unchallenged. And in that pause, the tension did not rise, it settled. The tension gathered slowly, as if no one wanted to be the first to admit it had shifted. Conversations that had existed at the edges of the room faded without instruction. Movement became economical. The space itself seemed to narrow, not physically, but socially. Several of the younger students watched Bruce Lee carefully. They had expected some visible reaction, defensiveness, irritation, or at least acknowledgement. Instead, he remained where he was, hands relaxed, shoulders level. Nothing in his posture suggested preparation for conflict. Those with more experience noticed something subtler.
Bruce Lee had not disengaged. His eyes were steady, not fixed on the veteran, but aware of him. He appeared to be measuring distance rather than words.
The veteran interpreted the silence as uncertainty. He spoke again, clarifying his position, reinforcing his criticism. There was still no shouting, no threat. It was, in his view, a teaching moment, one in which boundaries were reinforced by confidence. Bruce Lee listened without interruption, not as someone waiting for permission, but as someone allowing the moment to complete itself. His breathing remained even. His stance did not shift into readiness. There was no visible tension to release. A few people exchanged glances. The longer Bruce Lee remained quiet, the more the room's assumptions began to rearrange themselves. Silence, in this context, did not read as submission. It read as something unfinished. The veteran paused again. He seemed to expect Bruce Lee to respond verbally now, perhaps to defend his approach or clarify his intent. This pause was different from the first. It carried expectation. Bruce Lee met it by doing nothing that could be interpreted as escalation. No words, no gestures, no challenge. That refusal to perform, either submission or defiance, left the room without its usual cues. The structure everyone relied on began to feel incomplete, as if a familiar sequence had lost a step. In that stillness, something became clear to those watching closely. Whatever was about to happen would not follow the shape they recognized. It did not begin with an invitation. There was no announcement, no request for space, no attempt to frame what was about to occur as a lesson. Bruce Lee moved only after the room had settled into its uncertainty. The first change was almost unnoticeable. A shift in weight. A slight adjustment of distance. Those closest to him registered it before they understood it. There was no aggressive posture, no visible coiling of the body. The movement looked ordinary, even restrained. Bruce Lee stepped forward just enough to enter the veteran's range. He did not square off. He did not raise his hands in a formal guard. The proximity itself was the only signal, and it was measured, not provocative. The veteran reacted late, not because he was slow, but because there was nothing to react to. No attack had been signaled, no challenge had been declared. The moment remained ambiguous until it was already concluded. What followed was compact and precise. Bruce Lee's hands moved in a way that defied categorization. There was no flourish, no emphasis on power. The action seemed designed to be felt rather than seen. Those standing closest later struggled to describe exactly what occurred. They agreed on one thing: it was not a strike intended to harm. It was a demonstration of access, of how quickly distance, balance, and structure could be taken away. The veteran found himself momentarily displaced, not thrown, not struck down. Simply controlled, his posture interrupted, his center redirected. The disruption lasted less time than it took to understand it. Bruce Lee was released immediately. There was no follow-up, no lingering contact. He stepped back to where he had been, returning the space to its previous shape. The room exhaled, though no one had noticed holding their breath. The demonstration had not announced its purpose, but its meaning was unmistakable. No one asked for an explanation. Those present would later argue about the exact length of the moment. Some said it was 4 seconds. Others insisted it was closer to 6. No one claimed it was longer. The disagreement itself became part of the story, because it emphasized how little time there had been to observe anything clearly. What mattered was not the count, but the compression. Everything that occurred fit into a span so brief that it resisted analysis. There was no sequence to replay in the mind, no dramatic exchange to reconstruct. It happened, and then it was already over. During those seconds, Bruce Lee did not accelerate. His movements were not fast in the way people usually describe speed. They were simply complete. Each action began and ended without hesitation, leaving no visible gaps. The veteran's body responded before his judgment could. Balance shifted. The structure failed. For a fraction of a moment, he was not in control of his position in the room. It was not pain that registered first, but surprise. There was no impact sound to mark the end. No fall, no collision. The absence of noise made the moment feel smaller than it was. Only afterward did its weight become apparent. When the 5 seconds ended, the physical exchange was already finished. Bruce Lee was no longer in contact. He had not claimed space or asserted dominance. The veteran stood where he had been returned to, upright but altered. No one spoke. The silence did not feel imposed. It arrived naturally, as if conversation would have been inappropriate. In that silence, understanding replaced interpretation. There was nothing to debate, nothing to explain away. What had occurred did not invite opinion. The 5 seconds did not display superiority. They removed doubt, and once doubt was gone, the room no longer needed anything else. The veteran did not respond right away. He adjusted his footing slightly, more from habit than necessity. There was no visible anger in his face, no attempt to recover authority through expression. What registered instead was recalibration. He looked at Bruce Lee, then briefly at the others. The room waited, not tensely, but attentively. This was the point where words usually returned, clarifications, justifications, or even dismissals meant to restore balance. None came. The veteran's posture told a different story than his earlier confidence. He stood upright but no longer expansive. His shoulders were narrower now, his stance less declarative. It was not defeat, but concession without ceremony. Bruce Lee remained where he was. He did not adopt a victorious posture or meet anyone's eyes for validation. His attention returned to neutral, as though the moment had already passed for him. Someone shifted their weight near the back of the room. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. It highlighted the absence of speech more than any argument could have. The veteran finally spoke, but not to challenge what had happened. He offered no defense of his earlier words, nor did he attempt to diminish the demonstration. Instead, he redirected the room's focus, speaking about training schedules and moving on as if closing a discussion that no longer needed to continue. This, too, was noticed. Silence in this context functioned as acknowledgement, not public praise, not apology, simply the refusal to dispute what had been made clear. Those who witnessed it understood the exchange had ended permanently. There would be no rematch, no further tests. The question that had been raised had been answered in the only way that mattered. The room resumed its ordinary rhythms, but something fundamental had shifted. Authority had not been taken, it had been recognized. And recognition, once given, did not need to be spoken aloud. The story did not spread quickly. There was no announcement. No written account passed around in the days that followed. It moved the way certain moments do, quietly through conversation often prefaced with hesitation. Those who spoke about it chose their words carefully. They did not embellish. In fact, many reduced the event to its simplest form: a comment, a pause, a brief demonstration, and then silence. The fewer details they added, the more weight the story seemed to carry. When asked what exactly Bruce Lee did, witnesses often struggled. Some described hand placement, others mentioned balance or distance. None of the explanations satisfied the question being asked, and most eventually stopped trying. They would say only that it happened too close, too quickly to separate into steps. What remained consistent was the tone. No one told the story with excitement. There was no laughter, no bravado. It was spoken about the way people describe a sudden shift in weather, something observed, not celebrated. Over time, the veteran's name became secondary in the retelling. He was not portrayed as foolish or weak. If anything, the respect for him remained intact. The story did not require his diminishment to make sense. It only required the moment. Bruce Lee's role, too, stayed understated. He was never described as having won. Witnesses avoided that word. Instead, they said he had shown something, or that he had answered without talking. As the story moved beyond those who had been present, it became shorter. Details fell away. The 5 seconds remained. The silence remained. Everything else was considered unnecessary. Years later, when people spoke of Bruce Lee's early encounters, this moment would surface quietly among them, not as proof of dominance, but as an example of how little effort true clarity required. The story endured because it resisted drama. It survived precisely because it did not try to impress. And in that restraint, it continued to speak long after the room itself had changed. Years later, the incident remained a quiet reference point. It was rarely written about and almost never recorded. Those who had been present told it only when asked carefully or when recounting the early days of Bruce Lee's presence in the martial arts world. The story's brevity, its precision, became part of its enduring weight. Bruce Lee's reputation, up to that moment, had been growing steadily but unevenly. Among some circles, he was seen as unconventional, innovative, yes, but unproven. Among others, he was still dismissed as theatrical, a man whose skill was impressive in demonstration but untested against serious resistance. After that day, the perception began to shift. Not because Bruce Lee claimed victory or because he had loudly proven his superiority, but because the moment itself did not allow further argument. Observers recognized that skill could manifest quietly without statement or ego. The narrative had moved without words. The veteran, too, became part of the story's evolution. He did not diminish publicly, nor did he contest the retellings. His authority remained, but reframed. He was a witness, not a challenger, and his silence became part of the testimony. Even the most senior practitioners acknowledged privately that what had happened could not be undone by repetition or debate. Stories began to follow Bruce Lee wherever he went. They were subtle reminders of what had occurred in that small room, the unspoken lesson that mastery often does not need proclamation. Students, peers, and even rivals learned to recognize that authority could be quiet, precise, and absolute in its clarity. Over time, the anecdote contributed to a broader understanding of his approach, not as flashy or combative, but as deliberate. Efficiency and control became central descriptors of his skill, not through marketing or spectacle, but because they had been demonstrated once simply and irreversibly. The impact stretched beyond the room, beyond the witnesses, and beyond the veteran. It became a part of the culture Bruce Lee was helping shape, a recognition that true ability was measured in presence and outcome, not in noise or assertion. The incident was cited in private discussions, referenced in training philosophies, and remembered quietly by those who had been there. What lingered longest was not the action itself. It was an example of what silence can accomplish. That brief 5-second moment rewrote not just a reputation, but a framework for how skill, authority, and credibility could be understood. And in the years that followed, people continued to recall it, not as a battle won, not as a spectacle witnessed, but as a lesson in what mastery looks like when it needs no audience, no commentary, and no applause. The story had become legend, not through exaggeration or storytelling flair, but through the enduring quiet of its truth.